There are some places that seem to hold on to darkness, where stories linger like shadows in the corners of forgotten rooms. The Crescent Manor Hotel in New Orleans is one of those places. Its history stretches back over a century, but its reputation for tragedy and the unexplained goes even deeper. This is the story of what happened when a traveling salesman named Ethan Grayson checked into room 413, a room where many have entered, but few have left. It was the fall of 2018 when Ethan arrived in New Orleans on a business trip. A storm was rolling in, and the rain had started to pour heavily by the time he made his way to the Crescent Manor Hotel. Ethan was an experienced traveler, someone who prided himself on finding charming historic places to stay rather than chain hotels. Crescent Manor, with its aged facade, wrought iron balconies, and stories of grandeur from a bygone era, seemed perfect. As he stepped into the lobby, the air felt heavy, almost stale. The decor was ornate but faded. Velvet drapes hung limply over tall windows, and a grand chandelier swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. At the front desk stood an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back tightly, and a blank, glassy stare that never quite met Ethan's eyes. "Checking in?" she asked in a monotone voice. "Yes, under Grayson," Ethan replied, shifting his briefcase from one hand to the other. The woman retrieved a large brass key from a hook behind her, a relic from another time. As she handed it to him, her expression remained impassive, but her words carried a weight that made Ethan pause. "Room 413, she said. "Don't open the closet after midnight." Ethan chuckled nervously. "Is that part of the hotel's charm?" She didn't respond, only watching as he took the key and made his way toward the old elevator at the end of the hall. It creaked and groaned as it carried him to the 4th floor. Room 413 was at the far end of a narrow corridor. The door was heavy oak, its brass numbers tarnished with age. The key turned in the lock with a satisfying click, and the door opened to reveal a room that looked as though it hadn't changed in decades. Heavy red drapes covered the windows, and a large antique mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed. In the corner stood an old wooden wardrobe, its dark wood polished but strangely cold to the touch. Ethan set his suitcase on the bed and took a deep breath. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the air was cooler than the humid night outside. He shrugged it off as part of the old building's quirks. After a quick shower, he settled in, flipping through television channels as the storm intensified outside. The rain pounded against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. As midnight approached, Ethan began to feel uneasy. The wardrobe in the corner seemed to loom larger in the dim light. The draft he had felt earlier grew stronger, as if something inside was breathing cold air into the room. He told himself it was just his imagination and turned up the volume on the TV to drown out the creaks and whispers he thought he heard. But then, just past midnight, the door of the wardrobe creaked open a few inches. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the narrow gap, his mind racing with rational explanations, a loose hinge, a draft. But the cold air seemed to pulse from within, and a faint, rhythmic whispering sound began to emerge. It was a voice, low and indistinct, repeating something he couldn't quite make out. He stood up, heart pounding, and approached the wardrobe slowly. The whispering grew louder. With a trembling hand, he pulled the door fully open. Inside was nothing but darkness, and a mirror. A cracked, tarnished mirror, its surface dim and warped. For a moment, Ethan saw his reflection. Then it changed. The reflection did not move as he did. Instead, it smiled, a wide, unnatural grin. His own eyes stared back at him, but they were empty, hollow sockets. The reflection lifted its hand, even as Ethan's own hand remained at his side, and beckoned him forward. He stumbled backward, his mind screaming to run, but his body felt heavy, like he was sinking into the floor. The reflection's grin grew wider, its mouth opening to reveal darkness, endless and hungry. The last thing Ethan saw was his reflection, stepping out of the mirror. The next morning, housekeeping came to clean room 413. The bed was made, and Ethan's suitcase and belongings were neatly arranged. His shoes were by the door, his jacket draped over a chair. But there was no sign of Ethan Grayson. The police were called, and an investigation began. Surveillance footage showed Ethan entering room 413 at 11:45 p.m. It showed him pacing the room, growing visibly agitated as the night went on. At exactly 3:13 a.m., he stood directly in front of the wardrobe, staring into the mirror. Then, in a chilling, impossible moment, his reflection moved independently. It reached out, grabbed him by the shoulders, and pulled him into the glass. The footage cut to static. The wardrobe was removed from room 413 and placed in storage, sealed behind lock and key. But strange occurrences continued. Guests in nearby rooms reported cold drafts and whispers at night. Mirrors throughout the hotel showed fleeting, shadowy figures that vanished when looked at directly. The Crescent Manor Hotel remains open to this day, and room 413 is still available for those brave enough to stay. Some say that if you stand in front of the mirror at just the right time, you might see the reflection of a man with empty eyes and a grin too wide, waiting to pull you in. Ethan Grayson was never found. His disappearance remains unsolved, just one more dark secret in the long, haunted history of the Crescent Manor Hotel. There are places we visit where the walls seem to whisper, where every creak and shadow feels like a hidden watcher. But what happens when a place exists that shouldn't? This is the story of Jake and Emily, a couple who checked into a hotel for a weekend getaway, only to find themselves trapped in a room that defied explanation. By morning, the truth they faced was more horrifying than they could have imagined. It was late on a Friday evening when Jake and Emily arrived at Crescent Heights Hotel, a historic Victorian building nestled on the outskirts of a quiet, foggy town. The hotel was known for its old-world charm and elaborate architecture, a perfect choice for the romantic escape Emily had planned. The exterior, with its wrought iron balconies and ivy-covered stonework, seemed picturesque, even as the flickering streetlights cast long, eerie shadows. Inside, the grandeur was undeniable, but faded. The lobby's marble floors were cracked, the chandeliers dimmed, and the heavy scent of dust lingered. Still, Emily was enchanted. Jake, however, couldn't shake a sense of unease as they approached the front desk. The clerk, an older man with thinning gray hair and a peculiar vacant expression, greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to Crescent Heights," he murmured, checking in. "Yes," Emily replied brightly. "We have a deluxe suite reserved under Thompson." The man nodded slowly, rifling through a stack of old-fashioned keys before pausing. "Suite 1903, he said, sliding a key across the counter. It was heavy brass, ornate, with an intricate swirling design. Jake raised an eyebrow. "I thought our room was on the 3rd floor. The clerk's eyes flickered. "Suite 1903 is special." His voice dropped. "Enjoy your stay." Neither Jake nor Emily noticed the way his hand trembled as they took the key. The elevator ride to the 19th floor was unsettlingly slow. The ancient lift groaned as it climbed, the dim overhead light casting shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally. Jake watched the floor numbers tick up, but a creeping doubt began to gnaw at him. Had the hotel even advertised having 19 floors? When the doors opened, they stepped into a narrow hallway lined with thick patterned carpet. The walls were dark wood, and the air was heavy with a strange, almost metallic scent. Room 1903 was at the very end, the brass numbers dull and slightly askew. Jake slid the key into the lock, and the door creaked open. The suite was undeniably luxurious, but something felt wrong. The room was larger than they had expected. A grand 4-poster bed sat in the center, draped with crimson velvet. The furniture was antique, mahogany dressers, a gilded mirror, and an intricately carved writing desk. A crystal chandelier hung above, its light casting fractured patterns on the walls. But there was one glaring, unsettling feature: no windows. Emily frowned. "It's beautiful, but shouldn't there be a view?" Jake shrugged, brushing it off. "Old buildings are weird sometimes." They unpacked and tried to settle in, but a growing sense of discomfort permeated the room. The chandelier swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. The ornate clock on the nightstand ticked loudly, each second echoing in their ears. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Emily sat on the bed, flipping through her phone, while Jake examined the furniture. His fingers brushed against the gilded mirror, and he felt a sudden chill. "Jeet," Emily whispered. He turned to her, and his breath caught. She was staring at the far corner of the room, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" A soft, indistinct whisper, like voices speaking just out of reach. "It's probably just the pipes," Jake said, forcing a smile. "Old hotels make weird noises." But as the night crept on, the noises grew louder. The whispers became words, haunting, mocking phrases that repeated fragments of conversations Jake and Emily had shared earlier. Laughter echoed from the corners, but no one was there. Emily stood up, trembling. "We need to get out of here." She grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold, and her breath misted in the air. "Jake, it's locked!" He pulled and twisted with all his strength, but the door remained firmly shut. Panic set in as the shadows in the corners seemed to move, stretching and curling like fingers reaching toward them. The mirror reflected things that shouldn't have been there. Their own reflections grinned back at them with eyes too dark, too empty. The reflection of the bed showed a figure lying beneath the covers, something that wasn't in the room. The clock on the nightstand ticked faster, its hands spinning backward. Jake grabbed a chair and hurled it at the mirror. It shattered with a deafening crash, but instead of shards, a dark, swirling fog poured out, filling the room with cold, suffocating darkness. Emily screamed as the fog wrapped around them, pulling them into the floor. When they woke up, the air was damp and foul. They were lying on the cold, hard ground. Emily's hands brushed against something sharp, rusted tools. The faint flickering light of a bare bulb revealed where they were: a janitor's closet. The walls were cracked and stained, shelves lined with mops and buckets. The door was padlocked from the outside. Jake pounded on the door. "Help! Somebody help us!" After what felt like an eternity, footsteps approached. A voice, muffled but human, called out. When the door finally opened, a bewildered staff member stared at them. "What are you doing in here?" Jake and Emily stumbled out, gasping for air. "We were in room 1903, Jake said. "We need to talk to the manager. Something's wrong with that room." The staff member frowned. "Room 1903? There is no room 1903. They insisted on seeing the security footage. The grainy black and white video showed them entering a room on the 3rd floor marked janitor's closet. No suite, no 19th floor. Just an ordinary door. Their belongings were never found. The key they had been given had disappeared. Jake and Emily left Crescent Heights that day and never returned. They shared their story, but most dismissed it as a hallucination or a cruel joke. Still, they knew the truth. There are places that exist between shadows and light, where reality bends and darkness watches. If you ever find yourself in a room that shouldn't exist, remember to leave before it's too late. Some doors were never meant to be opened. There are warnings we hear that we shouldn't ignore, words that cling to the edge of reason, keeping us safe from the unknown. But sometimes, curiosity and fear make us step into places where no one should tread. This is a story of a solo traveler's stay at a remote mountain hotel and the terrible truth lurking beneath the bed in room 7. It was nearing twilight when I arrived at Summit Crest Lodge, a weathered but elegant hotel perched on a desolate mountain ridge. I had been driving for hours through the twisting roads, eager for a quiet escape from the relentless noise of the city. The fog hung low as I stepped out of my car, swallowing the last rays of daylight. The hotel's ivy-covered stone facade, dim yellow lights in the windows, and creaking wooden sign gave it a picturesque, if slightly eerie, charm. Inside, the lobby was warm but dimly lit, with a crackling fire and a massive stone hearth. The scent of pine and old wood filled the air. The front desk was a polished oak counter, behind which stood a thin, pale bellboy who couldn't have been older than 17. His sunken eyes and emotionless face gave him an unsettling presence. "Welcome to Summit Crest," he said, his voice a hollow murmur. I gave him my name, and he slid an old-fashioned key across the counter. The key was cold and heavier than I expected, with an engraved number, 7. "Room 7, he said, his fingers lingering on the key for a moment longer than necessary. Then he added quietly, "Enjoy your stay, but whatever you do, don't look under the bed." A chill crept up my spine. I forced a laugh. "Is that supposed to be a joke?" He didn't respond. His eyes flicked toward me once more before he turned and disappeared through a back door. The hallway to my room was narrow, the wooden floorboards groaning under each step. Old portraits lined the walls, faded images of stern-faced men and women from another century. Room 7 was at the very end, the brass numbers tarnished and slightly crooked. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was quaint, with rustic furnishings that matched the lodge's atmosphere. A large antique bed dominated the space, its heavy wooden frame carved with intricate designs. There was a single window, but fog pressed against the glass, obscuring any view of the outside. The bedspread was thick, and the mattress looked inviting after my long drive. But something felt off. The air was colder than the hallway, and a strange metallic smell lingered. I shook it off as my imagination was playing tricks and set my suitcase on the floor. The key sat on the nightstand next to an old clock that ticked loudly in the otherwise silent room. Hours passed. I tried to relax, flipping through channels on the TV, but the uneasy feeling persisted. My mind kept returning to the bellboy's warning, "Don't look under the bed." The phrase echoed in my head, gnawing at me. I laughed at myself for even considering it, but the curiosity burned. What was under there? A forgotten object? Some kind of prank? I decided to ignore it and go to sleep. The bed creaked as I lay down. The mattress was firm, but every time I shifted, the creak sounded louder, like a protest. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, trying to will myself into slumber. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It came from below. My heart began to race. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped. A moment passed, then came a soft, rhythmic whispering. The voice was too low to make out words, but it was unmistakably human. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my chest. The room was still, but the whispering seemed to be all around me, emanating from the very floor. I stood and stared at the bed. The bellboy's warning echoed again in my mind, louder now, "Don't look under the bed." I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling as I reached down. I knelt slowly, the cold air biting my skin. My fingers brushed the edge of the thick bed. I hesitated, then lifted it. The darkness beneath seemed alive. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. My eyes adjusted, and that's when I saw it. A face. It was my own, pale, with wide, staring eyes and a grin stretched impossibly far. It lay beneath the bed, motionless but watching me. By reflection, but it wasn't me. The figure's mouth opened, the grin splitting wider, revealing teeth too sharp, too many. It whispered in a voice that matched mine exactly, "Don't look under the bed." The hand reached out, skeletal fingers curling toward me. I scrambled backward, hitting the nightstand. The clock crashed to the floor, shattering. I grabbed the door handle, yanking it open. My feet barely touched the floor as I raced down the hallway. I reached the front desk, gasping for air. The receptionist, an older woman now, looked up with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked. "The bellboy," I stammered. "He warned me about room 7. He said not to look under the bed." She frowned. "Sir, we don't have a bellboy." I stared at her, the truth crashing over me like a wave. "But he gave me the key." She shook her head. "You checked in alone." When we returned to room 7, it was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the room cold and silent. My suitcase was gone. The broken clock had vanished. As I stood there, I heard it again. A whisper, soft, mocking. "Don't look under the bed."